Hotline Miami is the first entry in the beloved and critically acclaimed series of PETA games wherein the Kentucky Fried Chicken is breaded in nose candy instead of flour and proceeds to dome every single person that has ever looked at a cut of lamb, and also a few shelters worth of dogs, stay on brand. Developed by two Swedishmen, as implied by the name, the game was one of the earlier examples of an explosive indie hit, serving as the flashpoint for a borderline subgenre of similar games, the vanguard of one of the most well-regarded indie publishers working today, indirectly inspiring a massive action scene in John Wick 4, and being credited as one of the major factors in the revitalization of the synthwave genre alongside Drive starring literally me. A truly staggering amount of influence for an album with a free game stapled on, self-described as a top-down come-up. Oh right, the game. It's pretty good. Before we begin, a question. Do you like hurting other people? Get used to that line, I'm gonna ring it for all it's worth. Because this is a game with things to say. Are they interesting things? We'll get to it. Because more than having things to say, this is a game with neurons to fire. You play as former Special Forces member, current violent racist and closeted furry Jacket on his quest to snort a line the length of the US border and kill every man with a Russian accent within a 20-mile radius of his male living space. Say your prayers, Bert. Did the devs actually name this man Jacket? No, of course not. The devs didn't call him anything. The fans just needed a way to refer to him, and Denneton responded, yeah, fuck it, that works. Which, to be clear, is a philosophy I greatly respect for just how much it would end up influencing the creation of this game and the aftermath of its release, for better and worse. You don't find out a kinda glitchy version of your game is being heavily pirated and respond by uploading a fixed version to pirate sites without being both unfathomably based and maybe having a somewhat questionable approach to game development. Though I guess you can't get much worse than the standard, and that is the approach that got us one of indie gaming's pioneers in the burgeoning field of virtual crack cultivation. In that it's incredibly addictive, can cause uncharacteristically violent behavior, leads to a lifetime chasing similar highs that'll never quite recapture the first time, and likely being created in non-standard circumstances that yield fun and interesting quirks. Also, there's a lot of drugs. A typical level consists of arriving at a Russian mob hideout, picking your persona, and exacting brutal, excessive violence on your fellow man as the swaying screen, grody pixel graphics, and blaring synthwave numb every neural pathway that does not carry pure dopamine. Everyone dies in one hit, restarts her instant, and Jacket schmooves with the land speed of a Ford F-150, and ends lives almost as effectively.
They thought they could stop a demon, I'm back.
Door slams, gunshots, and melee impacts carry a chunk and weight that has them serve as the perfect percussion to what is perhaps one of the best video game OSTs ever manifested. Yes, I know that's a basic take, I do not care. Vanilla is great, water is the foundation of life, and whatever occult rituals of M.O.O.N, Coconuts, Perturbator, and the rest of the Denneton Warlocks performed to put this soundtrack together has lodged this game in the deepest recesses of my psyche since the moment I first heard it in the background of a YouTube video. It has never been easier to enjoy hurting people, with each new level bringing a surprising amount of variety out of just 3 enemy types: mobsters, thugs, and their babysitters. Which works out just fine, since all they really need is to be recognizable at a glance. And rest assured, when you get bull-rushed by Badlands chugs in a disco suit trying to cave your rubbery head in, you will be hard-pressed to mistake it for anything else. The actual variety comes from the level layouts and, probably the most iconic aspect of the series, the masks. Which I'm honestly kind of surprised never became a staple of 13-year-old edgelord culture like the V-mask or the jonkler. Probably because the game was unsubtle enough that even the gamers TM couldn't convince themselves the Jacket was supposed to be based. Even though, according to the original usage of the word, he kind of was. But what did they do? Well, primarily they lead to the co-founder of Devolver Digital accidentally advertising a feature that was never planned that the devs then had to rush and implement at the last second. Which is the first time I have ever felt someone should be fired and given the raise simultaneously, because the masks rule. Every level you unlock a new animal mask that grants extra abilities depending on what you pick. There's Richard, the mascot, Rasmus, the one you need for the secret ending, Aubrey, the one that makes guns spawn more often, and Tony, the one that invalidates the existence of every other mask in the entire game. I'm not joking, Tony turns your normally non-lethal unarmed attacks into arguably the best melee weapon in the game strapped to both of your hands at all times, while also shortening your normally vulnerable takedown animation into a 14-frame formality. And you get it by the 3rd level, so what happened with my first playthrough was that every time I unlocked a new mask, I would try it out for a run or two and then immediately swap back to Tony, because nothing felt remotely as fun or powerful as literally popping heads like there's a grassy knoll outside every single window in the building, to the extent that it remains one of my favorite masks in the sequel, where they nerfed it so hard you'd think Denneton Games helped on Overwatch development at some point. I'll still go through and comment on a couple I find interesting, but know that the one line I spend discussing discussing each of them will be longer than the time I actually spent using them in-game. This likely speaks more to my personal preference for unga bunga violence than the actual viability of the other masks, but it's my video and I get to choose the hyperbole. There's the one you use for high score runs, the one you use for speed runs, the ones that either outright don't work or are so bad they might as well, the ones that make Jacket an even more terrible person, the one that sounds incredible until you realize you can't bait enemies with gunfire anymore, and the one that is the closest this series has ever come to making you, the player, feel like a monster. The only others of note are Oscar and Carl. We will get back to Carl. Oscar, on the other hand, is an objectively terrible mask that serves no other purpose than putting a Virtual Boy filter over the game. But that's not why I find it notable. The reason for that is the fact that you unlock it right before Jacket's final boss level. And since its description just reads darkness, many a curious player, myself included, will no doubt try it out, only to find the game's ultimate confrontation smeared with jam with the exposure cranked down as the Badlands brothers get ready to eviscerate a blind man. Excellent bit, no notes. And while most people will just restart with something else, I know there's at least one person out there that finished the entire level with this mask because they thought it was some kind of artistic decision. And the thought of that just warms my heart. Okay, so it turns out the actual boss fight part removes the filter, which is fucking lame. 0 out of 10, moving on. So yeah, the last minute implementation definitely shows. But that's honestly pretty in line with the rest of the game, which is, in spite of its obvious success and quality, jank as all hell. Multiple masks, as mentioned earlier, may or may not be broken. Doors are kinda weird. It's possible to completely skip multiple levels by luring an enemy outside and doing a takedown to clip into your car and drive away right at the start. Like Jacket suddenly broke to the surface early and realized what the hell he's been doing. The enemy AI is... fuck, where do I even start? Well, to preface, there's a title card before each level that shows tips and advice underneath the level name. Most of these are about what you'd expect, if a bit vague, but then there's the one that tells you that enemies are predictable. This tip was written by the devil. There is no factor more prominent in runs I've lost, the smoothness of my own brain notwithstanding, than the AI acting in some inexplicable manner that I didn't expect for no clear reason. Will this guy in the next room hear me fire this gun and rush in so I can take him out in melee? Or will he ignore it entirely so Princess 2 rooms down can break the land speed record on her way to sample my jugular? Who knows? It's a surprise mechanic. Sometimes they just leave. Which, like, shit, dude, I get it. Thankfully, the compartmentalized nature of most levels means that you have plenty of chance to maneuver around that sort of thing if you have to.
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
And then there's some of the intentional design decisions that I changed against. As you progress further and the difficulty ramps up, it becomes apparent that one of the ways Hotline Miami ups the challenge is via larger levels with more enemies and more windows, giving them multiple simultaneous sight lines on you, which is by no means unworkable or unfair necessarily, but it does end up encouraging a more peek and fire kind of playstyle, which is generally both less fun and leads to lower scores than just, you know,
Beast mode, baby! We're all going down to Memphis!
Granted, that sort of playstyle is still possible if you've got the reflexes and map knowledge for it, so I'm willing to concede this can just be chalked up to a skill issue. The problem that doesn't have that luxury is the boss fights. And you might hear that and think, how do boss fights work in a game where everything dies in one hit? Excellent question. Badly. Every boss in the game ends up switching the mode of play from top-down shooter to a sort of shitty point-and-click adventure, as the gameplay of planning routes and mowing through hordes gives way to figuring out what exact sequence of actions the devs want from you to proceed with the rest of the video game. And they're not really hard once you know what to do, save from some kind of frustratingly small timing windows. So on a first playthrough they're a weird, if flashy and surprising change of pace, and on replays they're just kind of annoying. But forget the gameplay, what about the plot? Said no one that didn't make a YouTube video about this game. In all seriousness, there is a lot more here than you'd expect for how easy it is to just skip over the story in favor of the digital morphine drip that is the gameplay loop. But then that's pretty emblematic of the story itself, wherein a man drowns himself in the catharsis of nationalist hatred and senseless violence in an attempt to avenge a lost friend at the cost of everything else, unwittingly doing the bidding of both the hyper-nationalist terrorists all 50 blessings in their war against the perceived Russian scourge, and the player who's probably just here for a good time. A player of the game goes out of its way to interrogate via the enigmatic shards of Jacket's fractured psyche, asking both the character and you pretty pointedly why you're so enamored with gunning down other human beings without a thought. Do you like hurting other people? Which is an approach I can appreciate in the context of this game having come out in 2013, but with how played out the trope has become, it does kinda come across a bit trite in the current year. That said, it is executed on pretty well in gameplay, with the way the music comes to a screeching halt the moment you kill the last enemy in a level and have to wade through the sea of viscera you left in your wake as you walk all the way back to your car in relative silence as the high wears off and you finally look down at your hand. Although again, the jank can sometimes work against this effect. Do I enjoy hurting other people? You cannot convince me that this is a person. The ending, while conclusive and relatively satisfying if you got all the puzzle pieces, does leave some ambiguity to ponder on. What was that photo jacket tossed away at the end of the game? What was Biker's whole deal? Why is there such a massive Russian mafia in the US? And perhaps most confoundingly, why are so many black people signing up for the whitest crime family that doesn't cook a pizza? And while the rest are explored in the sequel, that last question is one I had to investigate on my own. You see, I had a very distinct recollection of a moment from my first playthrough of this game that, upon replaying for this video, I could not replicate. Turns out it had been patched out ages ago and somehow no video of it existed online. Denetton were covering their tracks. I had to go out and dredge up a fucked up and evil version of the game from the briny depths to bring you the footage that follows. You see, by bathing the object of our suspicion in pure, elucidating, scalding water, the truth is revealed. These are, in fact, merely Russians wearing shoe polish. Do I enjoy hurting other people? When they're in blackface, I do. Wait, what was I, Video game, right. So yeah, that's Hotline Miami. A game that was so much fun it ended up delaying this video because I bought the Hong Kong Massacre on sale on a whim and tumbled ass first down the rabbit hole of similar games because they lit up some of the same neural pathways the stupid chicken mask carved in my head years prior. A tumble you can learn more about on this extra video I made for Patreon. Because almost none of that shit made it into this script and I needed to justify all the time I wasted somehow. The first section is free if you want a sample. Check it out if you're somehow not sick of hearing me talk about Hotline Miami by the end of this video. Some supplemental material I did manage to work into the script though was the Hotline Miami comics. That's right, I never forget my roots. No matter how bad I want to. I considered also covering the level editor and the ocean of fan-made levels and campaigns it led to, but given most of these were made in the mid-2010s by a fanbase of largely edgy teenagers, I elected not to.
But I know where
my god.
where these cocks took them.
Okay, that's not really fair. There's a bunch of really cool stuff out there with their own stories and custom-made assets that could honestly probably make for their own video. But that is not my video to make, and this one's taking long enough as is. Plus, it's a lot easier to point and laugh at that one campaign that's just called the N-word.
That's racist. You can't say the N-word.
So starting off, we have Carl, a fan comic so good that one of the devs went out of their way to declare it canon. And it's not hard to see why, with it managing to take the pixel art and palette of the game's unmitigated violence and smooth them out while still retaining their edge, instead filing the jagged barbs of psychedelic rage into a sharp, clean, sober sense of impending dread, as a faceless side character is transformed into a herald of the apocalypse, the first locust of the impending swarm, speaking in omens as he marches to his gruesome end, knowing he can't be killed in any way that matters. It's an incredibly striking and evocative piece, which I cannot take seriously for the life of me because the character it so beautifully builds up is, in fact, 50 Blessings' strongest face eater. This is a man who, even in a comic portraying him as the Chad, walks into a nightclub with a drill, kills two dudes right in front of a group of heavily armed mobsters, and gets perforated across the dance floor, essentially accomplishing nothing. Taking the actual game into account, this is the guy that walks into a hideout filled to bursting with Russians, packing heat, carrying the worst melee weapon in the game, which locks you into a long, incredibly vulnerable kill animation, barges into a room, kills one dude with it, and gets his dick shot off. Which I guess got retconned, but this was still almost certainly intended to be some kind of background joke character. And taking the comic as canon, you could say he got himself killed on purpose for some unknown reason, but seeing as it amounts to literally nothing in this game or the sequel, here comes the airplane. Next, we've got the 4 mini-comics released as a primer for the second game. They've got some cool art, some kind of interesting insights into a couple of characters, but overall they're pretty skippable.
I'm on the Ivory Coast eating vermilion snapper. War is all I think about.
And technically so is this last one, but it's the meatiest by far, and I honestly still think about it every now and then completely separate from the games. Not necessarily for good reasons, but of all the things you can accuse Hotline Miami Wildlife of being, boring is not one of them. Where Hotline Miami 1 interrogates the dangers of zealous nationalism and the player's predilection for violence, and 2 explores, a lot of stuff, we'll get there. Wildlife spends every page of its short run to see just how many interesting character concepts it can blitz through and then completely abandon with no resolution whatsoever. We follow Chris, a man so obnoxiously xenophobic and conspiracy brained that even the coke fiends he hangs out with would rather go without their hit than continue to spend time around him. Ah well, more coke for him. And considering he lost his entire family when Russia nuked Chicago, he's probably gonna need it. Alright, the nukes. As is alluded to in the first game and stated outright in the second, this series is set in an alternate history where the US entered direct conflict with and got their asses handed to them by the USSR, putting the characters we follow in the midst of a country forced to swallow the bitter pill of abject impotence, as the country they fought for not only abandons them once the war is over, but enters peace talks on the enemy's terms. And if there's one thing to take away from Wildlife that you couldn't just get from 2 on its own, it's just how much these people despise Russians. Which, you know, makes sense, but good lord, it is constant. Like, forget the Red Scare, these people talk about Russians like they're the fucking Skaven. And Chris isn't the only one who hears someone speak Russian and interprets it as
Horned rat will eat your soul.
a rabbit, a crow, a lion, and a badger. Not exactly the rat's natural predators, but firearms, stimulants, and xenophobia will make up the difference, as each one sets off a chain of events incredibly distinct from the kinds of stories we see in the games. From trying to escape the country with the son of one of their targets, to being a Russian grunt that killed a 50 Blessings member and stole their identity out of resentment for the mob, to being fully aware that 50 Blessings is full of shit and just not caring, because they've fallen so far the only time they feel anything other than crushing despair is when they're hurting people. Each chain steadily intertwining until the final issue, where every single one is unceremoniously dropped all at once with all the impact of a cotton swab. We never learn what happens to like 80% of the cast, and what we do learn is so anticlimactic it legitimately feels like a fake-out for the actual ending. In a way, I feel weirdly qualified to critique this comic in particular, seeing as the abruptness of the ending is not unlike that of a manga that couldn't maintain an audience and got unceremoniously axed like 20 chapters in. I'm pretty sure that's not how American comic runs work, but like, Chris just stops doing coke by the end, man. Like, no explanation, he escapes to Beansland and becomes a boring nobody over the span of like 2 pages. All it's missing is the boilerplate farewell line asking me to look forward to Day Job Studios' next work. All that said, a lot of Wildlife's best ideas, even as novel as they were, come across as a pretty apparent reflection of the narrative of the game that preceded them. Hotline Miami 2: Wrong Number. A game whose discussion I am going to preface by saying that I think this is a good game overall. It expands the narrative from a kind of quaint early 2010s Is Violence Le Bad story to a super ambitious and, I think, well-executed non-linear narrative exploring all the implications of both the events and real-life impact of the first game. On top of that, it somehow manages to one-up one of the best video game OSTs ever made, outstripping the first game not only with its action tracks, but the variety of tones it covers, including the kind of music I never imagined could fit this franchise. The kind of soundtrack that keeps you pushing forward as you slowly come to realize that the game you are playing is a downgrade from its predecessor in almost every other way. Now, this is not by any means a new take. This game had a pretty divisive reception at launch, and most of my issues with it have been brought up a million times already. And that said, it's been getting a bit of a re-evaluation as of late, with people coming around to all the stuff it does do well, and deservedly so, there's a lot to like.
The perks done ate little cuzzo ass up.
But for the most part, I don't think the gameplay is one of those things. I am sorry, no amount of artistic merit can atone for casualties. Levels are exponentially larger and more open with much less cover, which, in combination with the outright sadistic placements of enemies with increased reaction speed, makes for an experience where one of the most common interactions you'll likely have with the opposition is that of being shot from off-screen by someone you can't see. A scenario that is amplified with the ludicrous number of windows they cram into every level, making sure there is never more than a few squares on any given floor that does not lie in the sightline of at least 3 different enemies at any given time. Legitimately, I cannot overstate how many fucking windows there are in this game. It's absurd. A lot of the time in places that make no sense. Why are there breakable glass windows in jail cells? Were they trying to create some kind of even more deranged evolution of bum fights? And even beyond the contrivance, so many aspects of this game seem like they were going out of their way to exacerbate all the biggest issues of the first game. The level design makes it so that without either extensive map knowledge or the kind of gamer reflexes I have neither the hatred of minorities nor the gender dysphoria to lay claim to, the only way you're completing most levels is crawling through inch by inch, one finger always on the look ahead button to make sure the goon squad isn't rolling up to flatten you from halfway across the map. And just generally, the game seems to go out of its way to give you less information to work with. Like, remember the mole mask from the first game that ruined your visibility as a joke? That's just how one of the last few levels looks on purpose. I know it's set in a nightclub, it's not the first one in the series, but it is the first one I had to worry about getting shot by someone camouflaged by rave lighting and potted plants. There are even more boss fights in this one for some reason. some of which are admittedly pretty cool, but most of them still stumble into the same pitfalls as the first game, i.e. having to flail around until you figure out exactly what the game wants from you, at which point it just becomes a speed bump on subsequent playthroughs. Most of the melee weapons are just ass now. I don't know why. I don't think they were particularly overpowered in the first game, unless you count Tony, which they thoroughly accounted for. But the majority swings so slowly that you're more excited to find a knife than a fucking fire axe. The latter does have more reach, but if you're in close enough to hit someone in melee, then you can probably just move forward a couple of pixels without much issue. The enemy AI, which I imagined would be shitting itself in new and exciting ways given all the room it now has to breathe, actually seems to have gotten more consistent in an effort to shit all over the player with greater efficiency. And there is a legitimate argument to be made for this difficulty serving a narrative purpose. You don't play as Jacket in this game. You're in the shoes, masks, and thick skin of a bunch of people affected by all the shit he and 50 Blessings got up to in the first game. And these people, as bloodthirsty as they can be, simply are not the same kind of fucked up as the man that single-handedly crippled the Russian mafia and took out an entire police station. The latter with severe brain damage. He smoked too tough. His swag was too different, his bitch too bad, and they couldn't kill him no matter how hard they tried. So the second game being significantly harder makes sense. On top of that, certain missions have you playing as a member of a military unit that is intentionally being sent on suicide missions, as the war winds down and it becomes increasingly clear they aren't going to win. Missions that are, accordingly, the first time I ever felt like a game developer hated me specifically as a person. So then from a gameplay perspective, you could argue that it's just designed around emphasizing the planning and maneuvering aspect of the combat, and de-emphasizing your capability to just Rambo through levels to stay in line with that narrative. But for one, when the most consistent plans most players will find are peek out of cover, shoot one guy, jump back into cover before getting dogpiled, and the time-honored conga line of carnage, I feel like something's gone wrong.
My shooter a crackhead, he looked like Woody Harrelson.
And secondly, to me that kind of reads as an I made the game bad on purpose type argument, which I actually do think can have some merit depending on the type of game, but I really don't know if the sequel to your self-proclaimed top-down fuck-em-up is the place to implement that kind of change. Especially considering that outside of the difficulty, the rest of the game does very little to reinforce that theme, being largely unchanged from the first game. You still have the combo meter and the blood-pumping synth and the somewhat confounding scoring system grading you on how good at madcap violence you are. Seriously, what the fuck is exposure? The game will bend and twist itself to put you in the path of as much carnage as possible, to the point that sometimes even stops making sense narratively. Like here, where you play a guy trying to escape prison during a riot that has to fight his way through the guards, until halfway through the level where you find and put on a guard uniform to blend in, only for the second half of the level to be populated exclusively by prisoners who try to gut you on sight like the pig you appear to be. You couldn't have just ducked out and changed back into prison garb, bro? Not like these fuckers have object permanence. And regardless of the character's motivation for getting involved in this kind of violence, be it trying to get an interview or being a Confederate, you have to go out of your way to take down every single enemy on the entire floor before you're allowed to progress. You're still pushed by the game itself to play in the same way as the first, and it just feels bad. A better example of adapting this sort of mindset to gameplay comes from Deadbolt, a game I definitely have my issues with. You want to talk about inconsistent AI? And that, in spite of the difference in perspective and tone, clearly takes heavy inspiration from Eyes Wide Shotgun over here. Except the enemies are bulkier, faster, and more accurate than you, so run and gun is just outright not an option. Literally, you cannot shoot and move at the same time. You have to plant your fucking feet and die like a man. As such, the game is a lot more deliberate and planning-oriented, as successful runs require you to familiarize yourself with the level and create a mental checklist of what to do in what order to get the job done and keep your calcium-deficient ass in one piece. Picking the right loadout, shooting out lights, taking cover, deciding what order to take out enemies in, and your final score is largely dependent on accuracy, not speed. You are a glass cannon that needs to fight smart, and the game emphasizes that by actually designing the mechanics and levels around it, rather than trying to retrofit an arcadey top-down shooter to fill that purpose. So with all that established, does the story of Wrong Number actually justify the microwave hallway it puts you through to experience it? Well, I think it does, but your mileage is probably going to vary. This story is doing a lot of things. Most distinctly from its predecessor, it goes out of its way to give you context for the events of the game, and so it's a lot harder to just ignore. That and its non-linear structure, on top of all the different characters and storylines it follows, can leave a lot of people feeling like it comes out to just an overly complicated attempt at Pulp Fiction. But I see it more as an extrapolation of that line from the first game. Do you like hurting other people? Because the characters, not unlike the players of the first game, all have their own answers to that question. Yes, absolutely. Of course not, none of this is real. No, I just want to know what's going on. Well, you haven't really given me any other option, have you? You can't convince me that this is a person. No. But I want to see the end of this. An ending that is, in many ways, a reflection of the series as a whole. Loud, violent, excessive, and leaving the world irreversibly altered in its wake. Wrong Number is a really weird game for me. Of the Hotline Miami games, I vastly prefer the first for reasons I hope are apparent by this point, but Wrong Number stuck with me in a way few other things do. If for no other reason than just the balls it must have taken the devs to see the easy road of iterative sequels their breakout success had paved for them, only to swerve so hard the vehicle threatened to flip into a death spiral. One of the first game's biggest selling points, outside the obvious stuff, is the replayability. It's the easiest thing in the world to boot it up, run a few levels, and then go back to whatever. By contrast, Wrong Number seems to resent you for even considering it, not only as a result of how long and punishing so many of the levels are, but actively deriding you to your face. Starting a new game after completion gives you a new cutscene, wherein all the playable characters are confronted by Richard, a manifestation of Jacket's psyche from the first game, now morphed into a sort of apocalyptic herald. Richard tears into them, into you, for choosing to return here, knowing full well how all of this ends. Knowing there's nothing you can do to change it. Like it's looking me in the eye and saying, what are you still doing here? What is there left to game? You didn't even enjoy— I heard your bitching and moaning through the whole of Casualties. I know you didn't enjoy this. And significant chunks of it I honestly didn't, but the parts that stick with you never quite go away. For me, that part was right at the end, moments before the bombs drop. A man who, over the course of the game, manages to claw his way out of the world of violence he was unwillingly thrown into, is told by the specter of Richard that all that ultimately amounted to was front row seats for the end of days. The man responds to this revelation with a grace uncharacteristic of the kinds of people Richard is used to talking to. And so, as a final courtesy, he speaks the 10 words I can only hope to be able to recall when I hit the end of the line. Leaving this world is not as scary as it sounds.
All through the soul.